It seems so obvious. We tend to be at least skeptical when we hear that McDonald's wants to fight child obesity, when we hear that Shell is going to tackle climate change, or that Facebook is standing up for your privacy. We generally don't believe corporate claims to make the world a better place when their core business is to do the exact opposite. Or do we? Interestingly enough, after 6 years of investigating the African activities of the Dutch brewing company Heineken, I discovered that more and more people do believe these improbable stories. And they are often highly influential. They include a prime minister, a whole bunch of other decision makers, and even the Dutch Queen. They are convinced that multinationals have become good corporate citizens who not only care about profits, but also about the people and the planet. In Heineken's case, they believe that the company is good for the development of Africa, that its presence is good for stability and for prosperity, and my favorite, that the beer company is fighting alcohol abuse. The company uses slogans like brewing a better world or growing together in Africa. So it's no longer naive to believe the smooth talking of a multinational. To many, it's now considered a modern way of thinking, and this has important implications. If we believe that companies really want the best for us, there's no need for strict legislation, enforcement, or taxation. Why would we need critical watchdogs from governments, from civil society, or the media? Instead of controlling each other, different parties can now partner up for a common goal. And this is already happening. The Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs expects multinationals like Heineken to play a key role in the development of Africa. The department spends millions of euros of taxpayers' money to support its expansion in Africa. I will try to explain why I think this new way of looking at business is risky or even dangerous. Let me start with two disclaimers. First, it's not my purpose to single out Heineken. My book, Heineken in Africa, is a case study on a multinational doing business in Africa, and many of my findings are probably also true for other big corporations. And second, I'm not your typical leftist journalist who thinks that all multinationals are evil and that capitalism is wrong. I think that multinationals can play an important and positive role in Africa, but only if there are sufficient checks and balances in place. When I started my research on Heineken in Africa, it was hard not to be impressed. I visited some of the poorest and most turbulent countries in the world, like Sierra Leone, Congo, and Burundi. And each time I came across a well-oiled Heineken subsidiary that got the beers all the way to the remotest areas. I even felt a certain sense of Dutch pride. After all, these were my people, headquartered only a 10-minute bicycle ride away from my home in Amsterdam. This changed quickly when I realized how the money was being earned. I discovered that in Africa, Heineken is a company without any moral or ethical boundaries. It's a multinational unleashed that wants to maximize profits at any price. And it's very good at this. According to the latest available results, Heineken earns over 40% more on each beer sold in Africa than in the rest of the world. So how does Heineken achieve such great results on a continent that's mostly known for its bad business climate? Let me give you two examples. To boost sales in bars and clubs, Heineken engages thousands of pretty young women, so-called promotion girls. They have to wear short, tight dresses in which many of them feel uncomfortable. And they have to charm the clients to drink more beer and to take the brand they're promoting. In Nairobi, in Kenya, I've witnessed how this works. The music is very loud, so if they want to be heard, the women have to stand very close to customers, who are mostly men. And this makes it easy for customers to touch them at intimate places, against their will. These women often have to accept sexual harassment as part of the job. And it doesn't stop there. Several women acknowledged that having sex with their bosses was necessary to get the job. They also told me that wages are so low that many of them accept to go home with a customer after work to earn more money. It's unexpected but true. Heineken as a facilitator for prostitution in Africa. It gets worse. Let me take you to Burundi, a small country ruled by a dictator and ravaged by a conflict that some qualify as a civil war. More than 350,000 people live in exile. Thousands were killed and many others were tortured or simply disappeared. In this country, the economy is so small and Heineken is so big that the beer company represents 10% of the whole economy and more than 1/3 of tax revenues. In Burundi, Heineken operates in a partnership with government, so part of the profits directly go to the regime. The chairman of the board of directors is the same person as the chairman of the Constitutional Court, which means that Heineken in Burundi is under the formal leadership of one of the most important judges in this country. If it wasn't for the support of Heineken, the regime would have collapsed a long time ago. And this is not me talking, this is a quote of a senior advisor to the president, who had to leave the country after disagreeing with power. According to the United Nations Global Compact, a set of business principles that Heineken claims to respect, it can be argued that the Dutch Brewing Company have become complicit in the crimes against humanity committed by this regime. As the Burundian Minister of Finance told me, the check that Heineken sends for the excise duty directly serves to pay the salaries of the soldiers, the police officers, and the secret service agents who commit those crimes. I have rarely seen closer ties between a company and a dictatorship, and Heineken is aware of all this, but they seem to accept it. These are just two out of many examples of Heineken's malpractice and alleged complicity to crimes and human rights violations. During my 6 years of investigation in 13 countries, I uncovered high-level corruption, tax avoidance, sexual abuse, racism, mass layoffs without decent compensation, structural outsourcing of jobs for employees who were already on low wages, not to mention Heineken's collaboration with violent rebels during a civil war in Congo. And then there's also the important role that Heineken has played in the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. At the time, the company knew that its beer served to motivate and reward the killers. But when it was asked whether it wasn't a good idea to stop producing the beer, the company answered, "Why? As long as there's a demand and as long as we can produce, then there's no need for that." For Heineken, business is business, even during a genocide. The scope of my investigation, both in time and geographically, shows the structural nature of many of these practices. These are no isolated incidents, but patterns which are part of a strategy or a system. Let me get back to Heineken's claim to be contributing to development. It's probably impossible to determine the exact sum of the costs and benefits of its presence in Africa. But contrary to popular belief, my conclusion is that Heineken is contributing very little to economies and societies in Africa. In fact, it is likely that the negative consequences, such as alcohol abuse and households' budgets spent on beers instead of useful things, are holding economies back rather than pushing them forwards. I certainly found no evidence of Heineken's claims to be brewing a better world or growing together in Africa. Heineken is growing and Africa is creating the wealth for its mostly Western shareholders. It's almost as if the colonial days aren't over yet. So how come all these influential people believe those stories? The answer is simple. Heineken is great at telling stories. Here in the Netherlands, we have a big secret. We know that Heineken is an average tasting beer. Nothing really wrong with it, but nothing special either. What made it a beer loved all over the world is storytelling through marketing. Marketing convinced people it's a drink for winners who compete in the Champions League or in Formula One. Heineken is classy, it's cosmopolitan, stylish. Even James Bond these days prefers the green bottle to his classic vodka martini, shaken but not stirred. For a company capable of changing an average beer into a product cherished by the world, it must be relatively easy to create a feel-good story around its African activities. And that's precisely what it did. The company created the Heineken Africa Foundation, which spends a small amount of money on some charities. It launched a program to help farmers, and it shot nice videos of grateful Africans. The message is clear. Heineken doesn't only bring joy, it also helps the continent. And international news media loved it and were excited to spread this message. One of the most striking examples of the difference between the story and reality came from a former human rights manager. On Dutch national television, she acknowledged that in hindsight, she had a bullshit job, a term coined by the American anthropologist David Graeber. Being a human rights manager at Heineken, she argues, is meaningless because the company isn't really interested in improving human rights issues. What matters to the company is to show the outside world the existence of this job and the existence of a human rights policy, not if it works or if it makes any difference. During one of the interviews I conducted at the Heineken headquarters in Amsterdam, another former manager told me this. It's hard to be an island of perfection in a sea of misery, but we try. So Africa, the continent where Heineken made billions of euros of money over the years, is presented as a sea of misery. People are poor, so they can't buy as many beers as elsewhere. The infrastructure is bad, so it's hard to distribute the beer. The lack of education makes it difficult to find skilled employees. And the absence of the rule of law creates uncertainty. Under these circumstances, Heineken's success is nothing short of a miracle. Of course, sometimes things go wrong, but isn't that logical when you're operating in a sea of misery? The rule is simple: claim success and blame bad stuff on Africa. Maybe the most important moment of my investigation was when I saw through this narrative, when I debunked the myth of Heineken in Africa. Of course, obstacles to business do exist, but I realized those same obstacles are also often advantages for multinationals. Poverty and bad roads make a competitor think twice before even entering the market. They create a barrier. And as a result, in many countries, there are only one or two players, which explains the huge profit margins. The lack of good education makes it easier to convince customers that drinking Heineken is a proof of ambition or that it's good for your health, as the company claims in Africa. And the absence of the rule of law makes it easier and cheaper to get the paperwork done. Sometimes it takes no more than a crate of beer to get all the necessary permits. It seems so obvious that McDonald's is not fighting child obesity, that Shell is not tackling climate change, that we shouldn't rely on Facebook for our privacy, and that Heineken is not brewing a better Africa. It's common sense that if a story sounds too good to be true, it usually is too good to be true. So next time when we hear a multinational telling us a great story, let's try to remember that. Thank you.